Hello and welcome to lecture number 2 on the Americas. As we go forward in time, we'll be dealing with a little bit less content each week. In these early stages, we're dealing with vast amounts of time and vast areas, and it seems like a lot of content. But don't worry, because the number of vocabulary words is still small. And so the amount that you have to memorize for the quizzes or for the papers is not too much. And so try to take in as much as you can, but then consistently I will always come back to the vocabulary words and the vocabulary sheets, which are all going to be in the files section of Canvas. So don't feel overwhelmed. And as we go forward a little bit, it'll get easier and easier and less to a certain extent. But today we're talking about the Americas. So we're talking about North and South America. And we're not going to talk about we can't talk about every single tribe because there were hundreds, if not thousands, of individual groups that had beautiful, unique traits. And for our purposes, because of the amount of time that we have available, we're going to have to talk about them in regions. So large groups or multiple groups, shared regions. And if you look at this map, it looks very confusing, but if you look at the key here on the left, it's divided into regions. And now we're not going to talk about all of these, but we're going to talk about most of them. And so we're going to start out with the Arctic. And if you look at the map, the Arctic area included some words you know. Maybe you've heard the word up here, Eskimo. And the Alouettes was also another group in the Arctic region, and there were more. But let's start out with the Arctic region. And the first keyword for the Arctic region is Barabara. And the structure of this thing looks like an igloo, kind of. And that's going to be our next keyword. But the Barabara was a wooden framed structure using post and lintel construction, covered with earth that had an entrance passage, partially underground, so they would dig a little pit, and then they would build this around it. And we're going to see that a lot in Indigenous people's architecture. Digging a pit and then building sort of half walls up around it with a roof structure that comes up over it, covered in a variety of different things. But a Barabara is just that, simply partially underground house built by the different Arctic cultural groups, group peoples. Cool. Here are some more pictures of the Barabara. So on the outside, it may have looked like a mound with a wooden entrance, kind of looks like a mine entrance a little bit. And then on the right, what we see is a stock footage image that I have found of the inside of one of these. So you can kind of see there's a horizontal line. The green is all covering where the pit was dug. And then these walls up around it have been built over it. And then they have sort of one post here that's holding up the central roof structure. Here are some diorama examples of the Barabara. And so they had a variety of other things as well, sort of a plank house that we see over here that we're going to talk about a little later on. But you can see how they would dig in and then sort of put posts and lintels to put just staves of long wooden material over the top and then cover it over either with thatching, which you remember, or mud, essentially making it an adobe structure, which we had talked about before as well. So the Barabara. And it was structurally similar to the igloo, which is something that you've probably heard of this in popular culture. The igloo was a dome structure made out of snow and ice. They were fast to build. They featured tunnels leading into the entrance. And they were carved into blocks and assembled and then patted over, kind of like the adobe of snow. They would pat over them with snow to fill all the holes and make them totally insulated. And on the inside, they would be more than warm enough for people to live and be out of the wind. And then the warmth of the people would generate heat. And then they would also have fires and their own belongings. And the Arctic subgroup peoples were very much into fur and leather to keep themselves warm and to make things out of. This is a woodcut of a group of igloos together. You can see there's even a little window in some of these so that they felt there was plenty of warmth if they were cutting a window. And the Arctic subgroup peoples, as I said, were very much into fur. Of course, this will keep you warm. We're going to see some of the other groups stripping their furs and skins of the fur and the hair and having just bare leather. But the Eskimos and the Alouettes and the other Arctic groups were very much using the warmth of the fur in their clothing. So we can see here basically tunics that have been sewn together into jackets, with a fur lining around the hood. And the Arctic peoples also had a variety of ways to deal with the brightness of the sun reflecting on the snow. So they had these really cool sunglasses of various types that they wore to keep the snow glare bouncing off of the ground. And then on the top left, we see a mask. And this may have been an artistic or ceremonial mask, but you can see that the holes in it are very, very small. So you wouldn't be able to see a lot, but this would also have that effect of blocking the huge reflection of the sun. So those first two words were Barabara and igloo. Here's some woven baskets, so woven from fibers, maybe straw or reed or seaweed that was available to them during the growing seasons during the summer and the spring. Geometric patterns are very prominent, and repeating patterns and motifs are very, 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 very common throughout all of the Americas. The plank house. The plank house is a house made out of hand split timbers. We're moving on now to the Pacific Northwest. So the peoples of the Pacific Northwest, if you think about Washington State today, and then Oregon and around that area, the Pacific Northwest. The plank house was also partially underground frequently, and it's remarkable because they use something that looks like modern lumber. It's very flat and thin, but they split it from timbers by hand. It's very interesting. Here's another plank house. And so we're going to talk more in a second about totem poles and the incredible Northwest art that the peoples of the Pacific Northwest made. But let's look at this plank house. It has a log post structure and a log roof structure, and the planks are making up the wall surfacing. Here's another image of that. So these could be quite large and house families, multiple families, and remarkable for its sort of rectangular interior, because they were building in sort of a rectangular fashion that feels much more like an interior to us today. Geometric art, bold patterns like this in bright colors and vibrant colors we're going to see throughout all of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This is a basket, obviously, of some kind. The totem pole is a hand-carved monument to family legends or to spirits and lineage, sacred or mythological beings, culturally important animals, and also depicted people or events. So if something happened that affected you and your family or your tribe in a large way, that might also make its way onto a totem pole. And each section of the totem pole had a different icon or figure that bore significance that would be related verbally. And there's still really interesting ones of these being made today by descendants of the tribes. Lots of stark animal imagery. And the Pacific Northwest people in particular had this very graphic, two-dimensional art style that feels very modern in a way. Clean, smooth lines and stark contrast against white backgrounds. Very, very interesting and remarkable. We'll see more of that in a second. But the totem poles had lots of different types of significance, and each artist and each family had different individual styles to make them as well. So here we see some more. Up in the upper left, there's a hand-carved wooden piece, and then these others are sort of modern graphical representations of the animal imagery. These clean, smooth lines were very prominent in all of their work. They would put them on their canoes, put them on their houses, as we saw. They would paint them. They would also carve them. They were popular as tattoos. Now we move on to the East Coast structures of the indigenous peoples. And while the Northeast and the Southeast had many, hundreds of tribes, and they had their own individual structures and cultures, we're going to talk primarily about two different types of structures that they used varieties of across nearly half the country out to the Mississippi. So the wigwam is one of our vocabulary words, and a wigwam was a variety of types of rounded homes with bent frames. On this one, you can see the frame is on the outside, and then they've used tree bark as the sort of wall structure here. But it could have been covered in grass mats, it could have been covered in dirt, it could have been covered in a lot of things. Here's another wigwam with tree bark, again with an exterior structure. These were small, almost always rounded. Here we can see one under construction, and here the bark is being placed on the outside. This is a diorama that I found a picture of online that I thought was really insightful to show how wigwams would be placed in a group together around an area that a family or a group of families would share the cooking responsibilities and sort of the domestic life. The inside of a wigwam could be a variety of different things, but the use of grass and woven grasses as mats would be a basis of an early type of flooring and softer wall interior than just rubbing up against the framework of your wigwam. You can see they have firewood storage under these benches because they want to keep their firewood dry out of the weather, just like their persons. And our second keyword for this area of the country, the east side of the country, is Longhouse. And so a longhouse was made of similar materials and methods as to a wigwam, but it would be much larger and much, much longer. These could be up to 200 feet long, and they could house an entire clan. And so the longhouse was just a much larger and longer version of the wigwam. But with many, many people living in it, it became more of a communal and city center type of space. Here's a diorama of a longhouse as it's being built, and you can see large beds inside of it that were probably shared. You can see down in the bottom left where a little fire pit is. They could have multiple fires inside the structure, and the smoke would rise up through holes in the roof, and that would make it much warmer on the inside than if you had a much smaller structure that you felt was unsafe to have a fire inside. Here's another picture of the interior of a longhouse at a museum. You can see there's shared storage and lots of shared horizontal space for bedding and sitting. Here you can see on the right-hand picture the holes through which light could get in. Otherwise, it would be quite dark, and also the smoke from the fires would be able to rise out. Being so small, the heat in general would still be kept inside. Fashion and clothing of indigenous peoples in general, we're going to talk about at the end. But overall, they all used leather and skins and furs. As we saw with other early cultures, small items of clothing like loincloths, as technology grew, the clothing grew in size and became larger, turned into wraps and shawls and sort of sarongs. You can see this guy on the left is wearing, with a lot of fringe as an early type of decoration across many types of cultures. You can see here that unlike the Mesopotamians early on, leg wraps for the indigenous peoples would grow and turn into pants later on as sewing techniques and patterning was further developed. For the Plains people, the people of the Midwest and the areas where our university is centered as well, we have a couple of keywords, and the first one is teepee, and it can be spelled in a couple of different ways. But it is a buffalo hide covering, typically on a tripod wooden frame. And one of the key things about this is even though they could be quite large, they were easily dismantled so that they could move across the plains following herds of animals. You can see here that they would be elaborately decorated or painted. So in breaking these down and storing them, the buffalo hide could be folded up or rolled, and the poles could be dragged along behind or carried by a group. So they wanted to keep it all as lightweight as possible. They would group these together in little villages, sometimes quite large villages, for protection and security and to keep everyone together. But there were strict privacy rules about who owned which teepee and who was allowed inside and at what time. And so for the interiors of these, they would have their belongings with them, their furs, their fabrics that they had created. And typically if they were a large teepee, they would have a cooking fire as well. Here we see a museum replica of one of these teepees where, again, you can see sort of in the lower section where people would be the most. They have covered up the framework with more leather and decorated it so that the area near you is covered up so that you're not brushing against the frame or scraping against it. And when the prairie people would settle down in an area more long term, they would build sod houses in a variety of shapes and structural methods. And this was also influenced by later on Europeans coming through and building sod houses as well. This one here you can see has some log house elements to it. And the caption for this tells us that this was actually in Nebraska. A sod house would be made of a variety of techniques, but typically dirt or turf grass bricks laid up the walls in sort of an underground area. And the roof structure would be dirt with grass growing on it as well. From far off and after a period of time, these could blend right into the area of the land around them. So now we've been moving on to the southwest region. And the first keyword for that is Pueblo. The Pueblo were a people who mastered Adobe construction. Now, we've been talking about Adobe throughout our previous lecture as well. And as you remember, Adobe is when you use mud and earth mixed with straw or animal dung to strengthen it. And you either form it up by hand or you make it into bricks. And then if you lay a brick wall with it, typically you would paste mud or Adobe over the top of it as well. And that what you see here is Adobe surfacing where the mud has been pasted on. And despite some small cracks, you can see that it's all very, very cohesive looking and it's quite strong and durable. So the Pueblo people mastered this in a couple of different ways. Not only were they able to make it strong enough that they had multi-tiered housing, and you can see some of the lintel posts that hold up the roofs sticking out of the side of the walls. Here's an image of Adobe resurfacing. So every once in a while, these bricks, the mud chips off of them, and then you come back and put another clean, strong layer of Adobe on top. And here's a little sketch of a cliff dwelling that we're going to talk about next. So the Pueblo people in particular had cliff dwellings that they would carve areas out of existing caves in rock surfaces, and they would build their Adobe and stone structures into them, sort of in a very together with the environment sort of way. We're going to see that again with the Incan people. This is a settlement of the Hohokam people, which were a very, very prominent and very large civilization in Arizona. And they had multi-tiered Adobe housing as well. You can see here that there's quite a large civilization. And one of the reasons that we are studying indigenous peoples of the Americas is because not only did they have smaller tribal structures, but as their civilizations developed, they developed cities and towns as well. And for us, that's the hallmark that we're looking for, where culture and storytelling really becomes a major part of a civilization. And so for we're trying to hit all of the highlights of civilizations that got as far as having cities. And so with the Hohokam here, you can see our first huge dwelling with many, many people, hundreds of people living together and having a system of irrigation and water and food sourcing. Here's another image of the Hohokam people, and you can see that their agricultural practice was quite robust as well. Of course, there were many other types of dwellings in the Southwest. On the right, we can see sort of an Adobe wigwam. It's a combination of all of these things, sort of a sod house. I'm sure it has a wooden frame that's been pasted over with Adobe mud in a rough fashion. On the left, we have something called a pueblita, which is a rock and mud structure made by the Navajo people. This is, of course, a ruin of it, but it was quite substantial at one time. The cliff houses. So as you can see here, in this sort of existing fold in the cliff wall, the Pueblo people created large stone and adobe structures for their entire city and all of their purposes. Some of them included mounded adobe, which, as we know, is the earliest form of adobe work before brick invention. And they were quite vast, the holdings and the number of people that would be able to live in these dwellings. So now we're going to move on to Mesoamerica, what is today Mexico. And we're talking about two groups that are easy to confuse because they lived very close together. But the Mayan civilization existed very, very early on. The Mayans existed up until around 1200. The Mayans were a people of southern Mexico and the Central American countries like Guatemala and Belize, and they had remarkable large stone construction. Something that we're going to see throughout Central and South America is amazing stonework that we, even today, struggle to really understand how it was achieved. They had a central religion that, as we saw with the Egyptians, caused them to construct very large temples and city centers. This first picture is of Chichen Itza, which is their largest and most elaborate temple in the far southeastern corner of Mexico, what is today Mexico. And here is Palenque, which is another area where they had built a large city center and series of temples. You can see here that much smaller stones have been used versus the large rectangular blocks that were used at Chichen Itza. Another view of Palenque. They would work these temples and city centers into elaborate structures, and so the Mayans are another people that had a civilization that developed as far as having cities and having vast empires and specialization of labor. And the Mayans had an incredible sense of stone carving, and a lot of their visual art that remains today is in the form of stonework, that incredible use of symmetry and geometric principles to create very, very delicate but bold patterns. Their animal imagery is somewhat evocative of the graphic design work of the Pacific Northwest peoples. Of course, the simple Mayan people lived in simple structures, but you can see that the adobe brick walls of this house are quite smooth and straight up and down, and that the thatching is very, very uniform. And so this civilization as a whole, even for their individuals who were on the lower end of the economic scale, still had a precision and a professionalism in their engineering that led to very clean structural shapes. On the left here, we see a vase that is left over from their civilization, very evocative of Mesopotamian and early Greek art that we're going to be looking at later on. Of course, one of the major things that the Mayans are remembered for is their Mayan script or glyphs. And you wouldn't be wrong to think that at first these look a little bit like hieroglyphics. And in the beginning, they had the same origin. They were logograms that meant each one stood for an idea or an object. But later on, as they developed, they became to be syllabic, meaning that each one could also represent a sound. And so there was a combination of logographic and syllabic usage of these. This is the only Mesoamerican script or visual language that we have been able to translate, or that scholars have been able to translate. What's incredible is that all of this carved in low relief must have been incredibly time consuming if you wanted to create a document. So I'm sure that these were created largely for official and important documents. The fashion of the Mayan people obviously was in a huge variety of clothing on the different areas that they occupied, the different times of year and different classes of their people. We see loincloths coming up in every civilization, and then as technology grows, the development of bold geometric patterns. But it's certainly interesting to note how the patterns differ from the other civilizations that we have seen. For different roles in Mayan society, whether you were a priest or a warrior or a worker, there was a vast variety of ritual and ceremonial headwear and clothing and costume for different events and different job roles. And so we can see all of that developing from their ability to work in metal and wood and to develop new fastening and new painting techniques. And so across the entire spectrum of the Mayan civilization, we can see that from the beginning of simple loincloths, which are not too different from the shanty of Egypt, that a huge variety developed as technology went on. And as is typical with early civilizations, a focus on animal imagery, bright colors, and geometric patterns emerged. Here we see some more different clothing based on different roles in Mayan society, and it's remarkable to see some of the animal skin being used here as a geometric pattern itself. the Aztec. So the Aztec lived very near to the Mayans, but they lived in central Mexico, and they also lived later. So during the time that we're going to talk about as the Renaissance in Europe, the Aztecs had their prominence, 1300 to 1500s. And they were a little bit after the Mayans, and they had a similar civilization, but also with some significant differences. The Aztecs, being a little bit later, were inspired by the Mayans and knew about the Mayans, and they built their temples even larger. And you can see that this is not too far off from the general shape of the ziggurat from the Mesopotamian civilization, but of course those groups had absolutely no interaction with each other whatsoever. Here we can see sort of a hut that's been made out of thatching on the roof, and it looks like reeds or other wooden structures of a pole frame being backed. It's not too far off from some of the wigwam structures that we see from the Southwest. Inside, they had an elaborate understanding of pottery creation, so creating vessels out of clay and then baking them for hardness and durability, as well as incredible weaving of baskets and different types of containers. And you can see also, I think that's a large gourd container up here that was used as well. Here's some maize and other food items from the Mayan or from the Aztec market. And they also had very bold but slightly different. You can see there's a little bit more of a looseness to the quality of the art here. Here's a picture of the Aztec market. So both of these civilizations, and all of them in South America, had thriving economies. Specialization of labor, whether you were a hunter or a farmer or a trader or a basket weaver, led to quite a vast amount of food and goods being traded and brought through their empires at any given time. This is a model of Tenochtitlan, which is the largest Aztec city with a huge temple district. The Aztec are the people that you probably have seen in popular media that did human sacrifice of various kinds. And it was quite intense from what we can tell from the from the architectural remains. Here's another view of the Aztec people interacting with one of their temples. And so for the Aztecs, their clothing typically was much simpler than some of what we saw for the Mayans, and more straightforward for the regular people to a large degree. You can see that there are some knot-tied sashes and loincloths here, alluding to a different understanding or a simpler understanding of patterning and sewing. But you can also see that for their rulers and for their priests on the far right, that there was an elaborateness to their fashion. We can also see in this, and somewhat in the Mayans as well, some influences of what we would think of as Mexican or Central American fashion and patterns and shapes today. The Incan people were the largest empire in South America. They were centered in the mountains of Peru, and they were particularly known for working their structures into the shape of the land. So whatever there was, and for that reason, we have found Incan structures even up until today, because they surprise us with how well they are hidden in the jungle and in vales and in areas where it would be hard to discern. But this, of course, is a picture of Machu Picchu, which is a very popular tourist destination. And if you know anything about the Incan people, you probably know about Machu Picchu, an incredible stone structure built on a very high and distant mountaintop. With the number of structures at Machu Picchu, we can tell that it was a very significant city center for the Incan people. And the most remarkable thing about the Incans is their incredible stonework. So if you look at the picture on the left, scientists are still mystified today about how they were able to carve joints out of stone that were so tight together, so specifically carved to interlock, with using nothing more than hand tools, no machinery of any kind. Their understanding of stonework and their understanding of geometry is very, very puzzling to us. Not only were they able to get joints that were razor sharp and perfectly straight lines out of natural stones and make them fit perfectly together, but if you can see the irregularity of some of these joints, they chose not to go out of their way to make just rectangles that would be much easier to fit. Rather, they used the shape of the block itself, but smoothed it just enough so that it fit perfectly to the one next to it. And so if you compare this with some of the more natural materials that were used by other groups, especially in North America, the vast amount of technological difference that we see here to be able to achieve something like this is truly incredible. If you look at the structures of this, it looks like a stone house that might have been from the medieval or Renaissance period in Europe. Here's a view heading into Machu Picchu through an archway, and it's noteworthy of how geometric and how clean all this stonework is, even though they are thousands of feet up on a mountain. And that geometric cleanliness and boldness carries through into their textiles as well. So we see very much an interest in blocks and geometry and the interaction of those shapes in all of these textiles and the patterns that we see here. And in their clothing, there was quite a focus on their ritualism and their religion, and they spared no expense or effort in creating very elaborate headwear and ceremonial garb for their higher-up people, their priests. Of note in particular is on this ceremonial axe, the corn cob at the top here is very, very lovely. Of course, the regular people had access to simpler clothing, but there was a predominance of geometric pattern and plant dyes that were used to decorate everything around them. Here we see a variety of clothing from a lot of different groups and classes. Even today, there's an incredible pride in the people of this land in the Incan Empire, and so a lot of reenactment and carrying through of their ceremonial practice exists today. So now we're going to talk about Native American clothing in general. There are, of course, thousands of unique variations and diversions from what I'm about to say. But in general, we can look and see ubiquitous use of leather, both deferred or not. Lots of fur usage in colder climates. We can see lots and lots of beads that are meticulously carved from different minerals and semi-precious stones when they were available. And we see throughout the use of vegetable dyes and other types of dyes, animal-based dyes, to color things whenever possible. And for people that we consider to be incredibly natural, simple, pure, their understanding of mathematics that would lead to the ability to make the geometric patterns that we see throughout stands somewhat in contrast with some of our preconceptions, and I think it reveals something that is much more complex about them. All the different tribes had many, many different types of individual styles. Of course, the use of feathers and other animal imagery and materials was very key. A feather is a complex object that has a lot of detail in it that you can just implement quite easily. On the left here, we see a card of Mayan clothing. It says late post-classic lowland Maya clothing, but let that just inform you of what an incredible variety there truly was. And on the right, we can see another image of that same culture. Of course, our understanding of the Plains Indians and the East Coast Indians is colored greatly by popular media and the images that we see. But a lot of the shapes and styles and materials very much were accurate to the peoples of those areas. The next few images come from a series of portraits that were taken of individuals of many different tribes. And I really wanted you to see them because, one, they're photographic, and so they are accurate. And secondly, because there's a huge variety of the different tribes. And with the little time that we have, it would be unfair not to try to mention that every single tribe had its own unique cultural identity. In this image on the left, we see a member of the Apache tribe. On the right, I'm not sure which tribe. On the left in this image, we see a member of the Tewa tribe, and on the right, a member of the Kahatikia tribe. Here on the left, a member of the Navajo tribe, and on the right, a Piegan member. And so we've completed all of our studies of the indigenous peoples. But I wanted to leave you with this image because this is a recent image of one of the last uncontacted tribes in the world. There is no evidence that these people have any interaction with outside society at all. They're deep in the South American jungle. And it's truly remarkable to see their structures, which are really very unrelated to any of the other structures that we've studied for any early civilizations. And yet, you can see that they're using posts and lintels, and they have a sort of covering over with grass mats, that is thatching. And for them, they have a communal structure that they've built here, sort of like each individual family or group has a lean-to structure that is contributing to the overall protection of the whole unit. Very, very fascinating and interesting. So here are our vocabulary words for the Americas. As I promised, there are not too many, and all of that vast amount of information has been distilled into something that I think you can digest. And I will be putting these vocabulary words in a sheet in the files section on Canvas, but let's look at them for a second. There's Barabara, igloo, plank house, totem pole, wigwam, longhouse, teepee, Sod House, Pueblo, Adobe, cliff house, Mayan, Aztec, and Incan. So this was very much a snapshot of a general sense of information about a large group of people with very many unique characteristics. And so I've tried to distill these vocabulary words down into something that is not only that you can memorize for class, but you could take away into the future and do further research that's really would be justified for an understanding of all these concepts. Thank you very much for being here on this lecture, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Please contact me with any questions or issues that come up, and have a great day.